In our last session, we discussed how to build an internal value system. Once you've established this within yourself, you'll begin to truly feel your own value. When that happens, you naturally become more confident, and with that confidence comes a powerful charisma. We used an example before of finding a celebrity's lost child, how confident you'd feel in that situation. Now, imagine reaching that level of confidence in everything you do. That kind of strong presence is what we're aiming for. There are 4 key expressions of powerful charisma that manifest once you've trained yourself. We'll break them down one by one throughout this lesson. Our training so far has been external, focusing on actions and behaviors that influence the internal state, and we'll later dive into internal training that influences outward behavior. For now, let's focus on the 4 key expressions of charisma. The first expression is clear intent. The second is self-control. The third is a sense of entitlement. And the fourth is self-amusement. That fourth point, self-amusement, ties directly into our internal training, which we'll cover later. But let's start with clear intent. Why does clear intent naturally emerge when we develop strong charisma and confidence? And conversely, why is it challenging to demonstrate clear intent when we haven't yet built that inner strength? Clear intent means knowing what you want deep inside and going for it without hesitation. It's about moving directly toward your desires without overthinking or second-guessing. For example, if you're hungry, you don't overanalyze, you just grab something to eat. If you see something you want, you reach out and take it. A child doesn't hesitate to ask their mom for a treat. They just say, "Mom, I want this." That's clear intent in its simplest form. But here's the key. Your actions must come from your true self, not your ego. Sometimes people worry that acting on their desires is selfish, that pursuing what they want might offend others. This is where we need to differentiate between the true self and the ego, a concept we'll dive into shortly. To summarize, clear intent is about following through on your desires without getting caught up in fears or doubts. It's about confidently expressing what you want without being manipulative or pushy. If your intent is aligned with your true self, it naturally exudes charisma. Even when your desires come from the ego, as long as you maintain respect and boundaries, never forcing or clinging, you can still express yourself with poise and charm. Imagine this in practice. You express your desire and the other person declines. You step back gracefully, giving them space. Later, you might approach again once you've strengthened your value and try again. If they still say no, you step back again, always maintaining respect and never crossing their boundaries. This approach is respectful and doesn't irritate others. Most people aren't bothered by someone making a request. They're bothered when the request turns into nagging or pressure. The key is to recognize subtle signs of refusal. Sometimes people won't say no outright. They might deflect the conversation, hint at something else, or simply not respond directly. That's a signal to step back and give them space. For example, if you ask someone out and they change the subject, that's a subtle way of saying no. Respect that. But many of us struggle with this. We often feel insecure, so we hesitate to express our desires clearly. We might circle around the issue, hinting at what we want without saying it directly. This can come across as awkward or even creepy, like a salesperson who hovers nearby without directly approaching you. It feels uncomfortable, right? Contrast that with a confident approach. The salesperson walks straight up to you and says, "Hi, I'm selling this amazing product. Would you like to try it?" Even if you say no, their clear intent leaves a better impression than someone who's unsure of themselves. This principle applies in every area of life: sales, relationships, and personal interactions. The more direct and confident your approach, the more people will respond positively. But what stops us from acting this way? It's often our ego, which leads us to overthink, worry about rejection, and hesitate. This brings us to the next concept: the true self and the ego. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This course is a bit like Alice in Wonderland, where we're diving deep into the rabbit hole. We're now reaching one of the most profound concepts in mindset training, one that I personally found life-changing when I first understood it. It's the idea that each of us has both a true self and an ego. Recognizing and understanding this distinction can be a real breakthrough moment. We've all had moments where we lost our temper or acted impulsively, only to regret it later. We promise ourselves we'll do better next time, but when the situation arises again, we repeat the same mistake. This cycle can go on for years, making us feel powerless to change. So what's going on here? The answer lies in the ego. The ego is like a small, insecure part of us that takes over when we're feeling threatened or vulnerable. It's reactive, defensive, and often driven by fear. On the other hand, the true self is the part of us that's confident, secure, and aligned with our deeper values. When the ego takes control, it's like a little demon steering the ship, while the true self gets pushed aside. Think about someone who has a history of losing their temper. They might genuinely want to change and even feel sorry afterward, but when the trigger comes, the ego flares up and they lash out again. The ego is running the show, and it's powerful enough to override our true intentions. So what exactly is the true self, and what is the ego? The true self is the part of us that we're born with. It's the essence of who we are before we're influenced by external pressures and expectations. Think of a young child, carefree, joyful, and unburdened by the opinions of others. That's the true self. It's naturally confident, happy, and at peace. But as we grow, we start to develop an ego. The ego is like a false personality that forms as we try to navigate the world. It's the result of all the labels, judgments, and expectations that others place on us and that we place on ourselves. Over time, the ego can become so strong that it takes over, pushing the true self into the background. Here's a simple way to understand it. The true self is who you really are, while the ego is who you think you are. The ego is often based on fear, insecurity, and the need for approval. It's what makes us worry about what others think, compare ourselves to others, and react defensively when we feel threatened. The true self, on the other hand, is secure and confident. It doesn't need external validation because it knows its own worth. When we're living from our true self, we're more likely to act with kindness, compassion, and wisdom. But the ego can be powerful. It's what makes us feel small, insecure, and reactive. It's the voice in our head that says, "I'm not good enough," or "I need to prove myself." And it's this voice that often leads us into trouble, causing us to act in ways that aren't aligned with our true values. Understanding the difference between the true self and the ego is crucial for mindset training. Once you recognize when the ego is in control, you can start to take steps to reclaim your true self. For example, think about a time when you felt really anxious or upset. If you look closely, you'll probably notice that your thoughts were focused on fears, insecurities, or worries about what others might think. That's the ego at work. Now think about a time when you felt calm, confident, and at peace. In those moments, you were likely connected to your true self. The goal of our training is to help you live more from your true self and less from your ego. This means becoming aware of when the ego is taking over and learning how to shift back into your true self. Let's explore how the ego forms and how it can take over our lives. We're all born with a true self, but as we grow, we start to develop an ego. This process usually begins in childhood, when we first start to become aware of ourselves and how others see us. For example, when we're learning to walk as toddlers, we don't worry about whether we're doing it right or how we look. We just keep trying, falling down, and getting back up until we figure it out. That's the true self in action. Curious, resilient, and unafraid of failure. But as we grow older, we start to become more self-conscious. We notice how others react to us, and we begin to form judgments about ourselves. We might start to think, "I'm not as good as others," or "I need to be perfect to be loved." These thoughts are the seeds of the ego. Over time, these thoughts can solidify into beliefs. We start to believe that we need to be a certain way to be accepted or loved, and we develop behaviors to protect ourselves from feeling rejected or unworthy. This is how the ego forms, through a combination of our own judgments and the judgments of others. For example, if a child grows up in a household where academic success is highly valued, they might develop the belief that they need to be smart to be loved. This belief becomes part of their ego, and they might start to worry about making mistakes or looking foolish. As they grow older, this ego-driven fear can hold them back from taking risks or trying new things. The ego is also shaped by the society we live in. From an early age, we're bombarded with messages about what it means to be successful, attractive, or worthy. These messages can create unrealistic expectations and lead us to judge ourselves harshly when we don't measure up. For example, if society places a high value on physical appearance, someone might develop an ego that's obsessed with looking perfect. They might spend a lot of time and energy trying to maintain a certain image, but underneath, they might feel insecure and afraid of being judged. The ego is like a mask we wear to protect ourselves from the pain of feeling unworthy or unloved. But the problem with this mask is that it hides our true self. When we're living from our ego, we're not living authentically. We're acting out of fear and insecurity rather than from our true values and desires. This is why it's so important to recognize when the ego is in control. When we're aware of the ego, we can start to question its beliefs and behaviors. We can ask ourselves, is this really who I am, or is this just a fear-based reaction? By doing this, we can begin to reconnect with our true self. Reconnecting with the true self is like peeling away layers of an onion. As we strip away the beliefs and behaviors of the ego, we get closer to our core, the part of us that's naturally confident, secure, and at peace. The first step in this process is to accept yourself as you are. This means recognizing that the ego is not the real you. It's just a collection of thoughts and beliefs that have been shaped by your experiences. The true you is underneath, waiting to be rediscovered. Once you start to see the ego for what it is, you can begin to take back control of your life. You can choose to act from your true self, rather than being driven by fear and insecurity. This is the foundation of mindset training, to help you reconnect with your true self and live a life that's authentic and fulfilling. Now, let's explore how the ego can disrupt our lives and what we can do to prevent it. The ego can wreak havoc in many areas of our lives, especially in our relationships. Let's take an example from a romantic relationship. Imagine you've sent your partner a message and they don't respond. Hours go by and you start to feel anxious, worried, and maybe even angry. You begin to think, if they really cared about me, they would have responded by now. These thoughts escalate, and by the time they finally get back to you, you're so upset that you lash out at them. What just happened? Your ego took over. The ego is incredibly fragile. It always feels like it's being threatened or neglected. When your partner didn't respond, your ego interpreted it as a sign that they don't care about you. This triggered feelings of insecurity, which then led to anger and blame. But what would have happened if you had been operating from your true self instead? The true self doesn't take things personally. It understands that there could be many reasons why someone didn't respond right away, none of which have anything to do with your worth or value. The true self is patient, understanding, and secure. If you were coming from your true self, you might have thought, they're probably busy right now. I'll hear from them when they have time. And when they finally did respond, you would have been able to greet them warmly without any anger or resentment. This is the difference between the ego and the true self in action. The ego is reactive, easily hurt, and quick to blame. The true self is calm, secure, and understanding. It doesn't jump to conclusions or create drama. It simply allows things to unfold naturally, without trying to control or manipulate the situation. This brings us to an important aspect of mindset training. Learning to recognize when the ego is taking over and consciously choosing to act from your true self instead. Let's say you're planning to meet a friend for dinner. You agree to meet at 7 p.m., but by 8 p.m., they still haven't shown up. Your ego might start to flare up, thinking, they don't respect my time. This is so inconsiderate. You might even be tempted to leave or confront them angrily when they finally arrive. But before you react, take a moment to check in with yourself. Are these thoughts coming from your ego or your true self? The ego is likely to make you feel angry, hurt, and ready to lash out. But the true self would approach the situation differently. It might think, something must have come up. I'll wait a little longer, and if they don't show, I'll figure out something else to do. When your friend finally arrives and apologizes, the true self would respond with understanding and humor, like, "No worries, I just finished reading a great book while I was waiting. Let's order some food." This approach maintains the connection and avoids unnecessary conflict. This is the power of the true self. It's not easily thrown off balance. It knows that its value doesn't depend on how others behave. It's secure, independent, and capable of handling whatever comes its way. On the other hand, when we let the ego run the show, we end up creating unnecessary drama, damaging our relationships, and feeling more insecure in the process. The ego's need to control and manipulate situations comes from a place of fear and insecurity. It's always trying to protect itself, but in doing so, it often makes things worse. The true self, by contrast, is centered in love, understanding, and acceptance. It doesn't need to control or manipulate because it's secure in its own worth. When you operate from your true self, you create more harmony and connection in your relationships. You're not constantly reacting to perceived threats or slights. Instead, you're able to respond with grace and understanding, even in difficult situations. So, how do we start to shift from ego-driven reactions to true self-responses? The first step is awareness. Pay attention to your thoughts and emotions throughout the day. Notice when you start to feel anxious, angry, or hurt. These are usually signs that your ego is in control. When you catch yourself in these moments, take a step back and ask yourself, is this my true self speaking, or is it my ego? Once you identify that it's the ego, you can choose to respond differently. Instead of reacting impulsively, take a deep breath and think about how your true self would handle the situation. This might mean being more patient, understanding, or simply letting go of the need to control the outcome. Let's dive deeper into the concept of the true self and the ego by looking at a real-life example. Imagine you've made plans to meet a friend for dinner at 7 p.m. You get to the restaurant on time, but your friend is nowhere to be seen. You text and call, but they don't respond. Finally, at 8 p.m., they show up, apologizing for being late. How do you react? There are three potential reactions, corresponding to three levels of self-awareness. Level 1. The ego's reaction, false self. At this level, you're operating entirely from the ego. You're likely feeling hurt, angry, and disrespected. Your thoughts might be along the lines of, "They don't respect me. This is so inconsiderate." You might even lash out, saying something like, "If you can't bother to show up on time, maybe we shouldn't be friends." This reaction is driven by the ego's need to protect itself and assert its importance. It's defensive, reactive, and often escalates the situation. Level 2. The authentic ego's reaction. At this level, you're still operating from the ego, but you're more authentic. Instead of suppressing your feelings, you express them honestly. You might say, "I was really frustrated waiting for you. It felt like you didn't value my time." This reaction is more genuine, but it's still rooted in the ego's need for validation and recognition. It's an improvement over the first level because it's honest, but it still leaves you feeling vulnerable and dependent on the other person's response. Level 3. The true self's reaction, true self. At this highest level of self-awareness, you're operating from your true self. When your friend arrives late, you might say something like, "I was just finishing a great book while I waited. No worries." You're not taking their lateness personally, and you're not letting it affect your mood or your relationship. You understand that their lateness is about them, not you, and you remain centered and calm. This reaction comes from a place of inner strength and security. You're not looking for validation or recognition because you already feel complete and whole within yourself. The key difference between these three levels is where you're coming from, whether it's from a place of insecurity and fear, the ego, or a place of inner strength and peace, the true self. The higher your level of self-awareness, the less reactive and more understanding you become. You're able to maintain your sense of self-worth, regardless of how others behave. This is the power of living from your true self. It allows you to navigate life's challenges with grace, confidence, and resilience. You're not constantly reacting to external circumstances. Instead, you're responding from a place of inner stability and peace. As you continue to practice this, you'll find that your relationships improve, your stress levels decrease, and you start to live a life that's more aligned with your true values and desires. This is the essence of mindset training, reclaiming your true self and living from a place of inner strength and peace. Remember, you have the right to take control of your life and live from your true self. The ego may try to take over, but with awareness and practice, you can learn to stay connected to your true self and live a life that's authentic and fulfilling. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.